Graham Potter has been sacked by Chelsea Football Club, and the club continues to perform below expectations following his dismissal. The costs of his appointment and subsequent dismissal will add to the financial woes of the football club. But will this be an issue? We've previously discussed the FFP position of Chelsea Football Club, and you can see a link up in the top corner. If you want to refresh yourself, feel free and go and have a look at that video. But things continually change, and football is a fast-paced industry. When it comes to on-pitch performance, it has a significant direct link to the finances of the club. But a decision to sack a manager, especially one that's just been effectively bought out of his previous contract, could have a detrimental impact on the overall position of the club. So let's have a look at this further. Before we get started, my name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. This channel's dedicated to teaching you about finance concepts through the medium of football. If that sounds like something that is of interest to you, feel free to support us by hitting subscribe. Like the video, share it with your friends and leave us a comment. None of that will cost you any money whatsoever. But if you are interested in learning more on a formal basis, head to www.footballfinancepro.com, where you can work with us to learn formally about football finance concepts. Given the statutory reporting cycle of a privately owned legal entity, which most football clubs are, it's difficult to understand in real time where the financial position of the club is. Listed companies are different in that they have more frequent reporting obligations. They're still out of date by the time they come out, but at least we know what's going on in the same season. So Manchester United, for example, provide more information than Chelsea. For the current season 22-23, we're likely to have to wait another 12 months approximately before we can see the full impact of Chelsea's spending spree combined with sacking Graham Potter. At present, and at the time of recording this video, Chelsea sit 11th in the Premier League, in the bottom half of the league, which is unheard of in recent times. The club is 17 points off Champions League qualification, which from a budgeting perspective financially would be their minimum position that they want to or expect to finish in each season. Based on Premier League distributions alone, finishing 11th versus finishing 4th would cost the club approximately £15 million. Each place in the league is worth just over £2 million each, and that generally increases with each broadcasting deal. The cost of not being able to compete in the Champions League in the following season could be more than £70 million, but that again would depend on the theoretical on-pitch performance of what would have been the club's performance in the next season. And if they're not competing, they'll get none of that. Combining the transfer spend in excess of £550 million in 22-23 alone with the settlement agreement for Thomas Tuchel, which happened within this financial year, and acquiring the services of Graham Potter from Brighton and subsequently firing him, will lead to an accounting nightmare for Chelsea in the present season. But how would these costs or lost revenues be accounted for? Firstly, we'd need to look at the budget. And as we've mentioned, the club would be expecting to finish in the top 4 of the Premier League each season at a minimum. And the new owners, Todd Bowley and Clearlake Capital, will have had the same expectations as the previous owner when it comes to on-pitch performance. So if we wind back to the point of acquisition last year, which was approximately at the end of last season, the club would have set out a budget. And that budget would have included some transfer spend within the summer window. And Chelsea would have set out their assumed on-pitch performance both in the Champions League and in the Premier League in the current season. From a Champions League perspective, they would have expected a minimum of the quarter-finals. And from the Premier League, as we've mentioned, a top 4 position, which would allow them to try to compete again in the Champions League next season. Based on that budget with financial fair play considerations wrapped around it, the club went and spent £250 million in the summer window. And that figure isn't necessarily unusually large for a Big Six club, and could have potentially been around about the budgeted figure. The length of contracts would have been dictated by the budget or other factors. But then, as soon as the January transfer window came around, the club spent another £300 million in an attempt to save their season. And saving their season would have definitely included Champions League qualification. But instead, the reverse has happened. And generally, spending more on player wages and player transfers correlates with better on-pitch success. Now we know that the player contracts are amortised over the length of the player's contract with a nil net book value at the end because the player is able to walk away due to what's called the Bosman ruling. So a £50 million acquisition cost over a 5-year contract costs the club from a profit and loss perspective and an FFP perspective £10 million a year. The revenues that the club generates would be dependent on the performance obligations in the season in which they relate. So the lost revenues for a lack of Premier League performance would impact the 22-23 financial year. The lack of Champions League qualification in the 22-23 financial year would not be seen until the following financial year, because that's the financial year to which the Champions League qualification relates. We know from our previous video looking at Chelsea's FFP or FSR UEFA compliance that the 22-23 season isn't relevant when it comes to being assessed. It's only being reported to UEFA. And UEFA have also reset the clock when it comes to historical losses. And assuming a lack of sporting performance, i.e. a lack of requiring a licence in the 23-24 season, then at the moment, the 22-23 financial results are irrelevant from UEFA's perspective. And there's much more time to be able to make up any losses when it comes to compliance with UEFA's financial sustainability regulations. However, the Premier League rules are different. The Premier League continually monitors a 3-year rolling cycle and hasn't cut off as a result of any COVID impact. And what Chelsea have done, having now released their financial statements for 21-22, is they have impaired player-related costs up to £76.7 million in 21-22 and £17 million in 2021. This correlates to when the Premier League has allowed for COVID-19 related losses to be essentially relieved or added back in the profitability and sustainability calculations. So is it a coincidence that this impairment has occurred in that period? If the impairment can be attributed to the pandemic, then Chelsea is able to adjust these figures in the profitability and sustainability calculation. Those that were listening at the start of the video will recall that we as general public will need to wait until Chelsea release their next set of financial statements to understand the impact of the current financial year, and that could be up to approximately 12 months from now. However, the Premier League, as part of its rules, has access to forecasts and requests these forecasts from every club in the league. So as of the 1st of March 2023, Chelsea and every other club within the league will have presented its financial forecast to the league. And for Chelsea, this would include forecasts of profit and loss and adjusted earnings before tax, taking into account all the calculations in profitability and sustainability as a result of its historical loss-making position from a pure P&L perspective. Under Premier League rules, if a club has aggregated losses before tax over the previous 3 seasons, then this additional reporting requirement kicks in. And since Chelsea have made historical losses in the previous 3 seasons of £115 million of a loss last season, £148 million of a loss the previous season, and a £40 million profit the season before that, that equates to a £223 million loss in aggregate, which triggers this 1st of March reporting requirement to the Premier League, which states that the club must submit a forecast to the end of the season, including all of those adjustments in the profitability and sustainability regulations in order to comply with the Premier League rules. Since Graham Potter was not sacked on the 1st of March, and it may or may not have been the intention of the club to sack him at that point, the forecast may or may not have included the costs associated with Graham's dismissal. Now, since Chelsea acquired Graham Potter's services from Brighton, they essentially had to buy out his contract, and that value was £22 million. And if Graham were to stay at the club for the length of his contract, that cost could have been capitalised and amortised just like a player's registration, and this is acceptable under UEFA's rules. However, given the fact that Graham's now been sacked, any cost that was capitalised on the balance sheet will need to be impaired or effectively written off, hitting the profit and loss account in 22-23. So although some of that amount would have been amortised already, the full amount of £22 million would have been unexpected to hit the profit and loss account in this season. In addition to that, Graham Potter has reportedly received a salary of £7 million to date, and the costs to release Thomas Tuchel were approximately £10 million back in September 2022. The figure reported to settle Graham Potter's contract at the point of termination was reported at £13 million. So the total managerial costs come in at a reported £50 million for Chelsea's manager alone in the period. And that's not even a full season at this point in time. The question being, what was reported to the Premier League Would the Premier League now need to adjust for that figure? And could that mean that the club is in financial fair play difficulties with the Premier League? This, combined with the continued poor performance in the Premier League and a quarter-final exit in the Champions League at the hands of Real Madrid, mean that Chelsea have very little cards left to be able to pull things out of the bag financially when it comes to any issues that either the managerial decisions or transfer decisions have had in this financial season. If there is a profitability and sustainability issue, the only way that Chelsea are going to be able to deal with this is to sell players. And they will need to sell players before the 30th of June 2023. We don't have access to the Premier League's profitability and sustainability calculations, and we definitely don't have them for what's been estimated so far. But given the recent change in the Premier League's appetite to clamp down on financial misdemeanours, such as Manchester City and with Everton, then it may not be too long till we find out that there's an announcement about Chelsea and financial fair play issues on the Premier League's website. Under normal circumstances, Chelsea would be more concerned about UEFA's stricter rules than that of the Premier League's. But given the significant historical losses that they've made over particularly the last two seasons, and what is undoubtedly going to be another loss-making season in 22-23, the club may have an issue. What are your thoughts on Chelsea's season? Was this expected? Most people would say that this was absolutely unexpected. But the whole season appears to be turning out to be totally unexpected, which is great from a neutral's perspective. We really hope you've learned something by watching this video, and thanks for watching until the end. If you liked the video, please leave us a like, share the content with your friends, and subscribe by hitting the button below. If you want to learn more about the topic of football finance on a more formal basis, head to www.footballfinancepro.com, where you can learn how we're collaborating with Loughborough University, the best sports educational establishment in the world, to bring you the professional certificate in football finance, where you'll be able to leverage my experience in football at the highest level. Thanks for watching. My name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. We'll see you next week.